back in 2010, my wife and I visited Japan. We visited our nephew, Ben, his wife, Yuri, and their children, Mai and Lin. Yuri is Japanese, and Ben has lived in Japan since the early 1990s when he graduated from college. One Saturday, while we were with them, the whole group of us visited some friends of theirs. We visited during a neighborhood festival, and as part of this neighborhood festival, the neighborhood shrine was carried through the neighborhood by teams of men. In the course of the procession with the shrine, there were many stops that would travel a few hundred feet and then would stop, and the men would refresh themselves. During one of these stops, one of the men bearing the shrine approached me. I looked a little different. He established that I was from America and asked, "Where?" I said, "Tennessee." Blank look. So I thought, okay, what will define Tennessee? Elvis? Well, okay, the most recent Democratic nominee for president, Al Gore? Still blank. And then he made an association. Jack Daniels. To this man, Tennessee means Jack Daniels. Maybe not a standard translation, but an interesting one. And he went off and came back and presented me with a bottle of the Japanese equivalent, Suntory. After I emptied the Suntory bottle of its original contents, it became my water bottle for the rest of the trip. And obviously, I held on to it. Interesting translation. Tennessee equals Jack Daniels and is equivalent to Suntory. Later in the trip, we took a guided tour through a couple of cities and some beautiful spots in the Japanese countryside. I'm not a big fan of huge cities, but I love the countryside. Oh, beautiful. One of our overnight stops was in a Buddhist monastery. And the tour guide had expected that the abbot of the monastery would meet with our group. He was busy with something and instead dispatched his mother to meet with us. His mother also happened to be the widow of the previous abbot of the monastery. Sort of a pattern here, maybe. Anyhow, his mother, a woman, I think in her late 80s, maybe early 90s, was fabulous. Among other things, she told us about having gone off to college and been criticized when she came home, because in college she had studied English. When she got home, it was the war years, and she was criticized for studying an enemy language. She said the criticism continued for 4 or 5 years and came to a sudden stop. In September of 1945, she was suddenly a very valuable person in her local community. She was called on quite regularly, quite frequently, to assist in communication with the American occupation forces. Suddenly, it was no longer an enemy language. It was a great asset. Translation, working across barriers. What once was bad became something very good. Now, translation is hard work. It often asks us to move beyond our comfort zone. It often asks us to ditch some of our cultural norms. Now, I suspect that most of us here have been very attuned to American norms, experiences, and reference points. For example, if I say 9/11 or September 11, what am I talking about? Twin Towers, Pentagon. Okay. We just proved that we're very American and that none of us are Chilean. September 11 is a significant date in Chile. On September 11, 1973, a U.S.-supported military coup deposed the elected government and installed a relatively long-lasting dictatorship in Chile. September 11 means something different there than it does here. Translation requires one to do some shifting. Shifting of thinking, shifting of reference points, shifting of assumptions. So, let's try the hard work of translating the term white supremacy so it can be useful for us in looking at our society here in America today. White supremacy strikes most, probably all of us. It's a pretty harsh term, a term that grates. It makes us think of Nathan Bedford Forrest. I'm glad that wasn't my Japanese acquaintance's association with Tennessee, or David Duke, or yesterday in Charlottesville. Charlottesville yesterday was a display of white nationalism, a particularly virulent, vicious, consciously, intentionally vicious form of white supremacy. But white supremacy can have other dimensions too. We need to get beyond the very worst associations, not get hung up on the Nathan Bedford Forrests, because those heighten our defensiveness when we say Unitarian Universalism needs to deal with a culture of white supremacy. White supremacy in this case is not a critique of any one of us personally. It's not saying, oh, you left your Klan hood at home. That's not what it's about. It's a description of American society. If we are fish, white supremacy is the water that we swim in here in America. White supremacy describes all of society, not just extremists, and certainly not just the South. Some examples that I've encountered in my life. I'm a graduate of Yale University, pretty good school. I was not admitted to Yale because I was one of the 1,000 best and brightest students in America that year. Not the case. Two things squeaked me into that class. One was, my father had gone there. I'm a legacy. Okay, they try to keep alumni happy. Also, I was from Kentucky. Well, high school student from Kentucky, that's sort of exotic. It adds something a little different. So, we let a few of them in. Now, you need to look at the rest of the makeup of my class. About 1,000 students, and like the 3 classes before it and the 3 classes that followed it, my class had between 4 and 6 black members. Actually, I think all 7 of those classes had precisely between 4 and 6 black members. This was an era when you clipped your high school yearbook picture to your college application. Between 4 and 6. That means that each class at Yale in the late 1950s and early 1960s had 5 more black students in that class than were attending Ole Miss. Wow, isn't that a great credit to Yale? White supremacist attitudes allowed 5 of them into one of our finest schools. Maybe you've heard of sundown towns. Sundown towns are communities with no black residents and a very clear understanding, sometimes spelled out explicitly by a sign at the city limits. If you're black, don't be here when the sun goes down. Sundown towns are not particularly a phenomenon of the South. A friend of ours, Jim Lowen, has written the book on sundown towns. He says there are 3 identifiable sundown towns in the state of Mississippi. 3 that have a history of being sundown towns at some point. There are over 500 sundown towns in his home state of Illinois. 500 in Illinois. White supremacy permits such racial exclusion. I was first conscious in some way of what we now use the label white supremacy for. In 1968, a black caucus was formed within Unitarian Universalism. A good friend of ours, Hayward Henry, was elected as chair of the Black Caucus. And Hayward spoke, I think probably in January, maybe in February, to the greater Boston area Unitarian Universalist ministers. I was there at that meeting. In the course of his remarks, Hayward said something about all you non-blacks. Well, that's an accurate description of me, but I'd never thought of myself as non-black. I'd had a different measuring stick, a different reference point. But yeah, non-black is every bit as accurate as white. I just had never before seen myself that way. And as I think back to that occasion, I also remember another time when Hayward was very conscious of white supremacy. Judy and I don't remember why, we were visiting Hayward and Martha in their apartment. The two couples were both young newlyweds. 1963. Anyhow, Hayward and Martha pointed out to us the cake topper from their wedding cake in Martha's hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts. This black couple had as their wedding cake topper a pair of pink plastic people, because white was the default understanding of people. There's a photo of me. Yeah, there's a photo of me that has white supremacy aspects. It shows me and my colleague Ira Blaylock, Ira on the left, standing with Dr. King in Selma, Alabama. Ira and I had just been released from jail after serving 7 days of a 5-day jail sentence. This is Alabama arithmetic. A person on Dr. King's staff had arranged for this picture to be taken. It's an Associated Press wire photo. Went out all over the country. Now, this was about a month into the Selma voting rights campaign, the very active phase led by Dr. King. Hundreds of people, maybe 1,000 or more people, had been arrested in the course of that month. Several hundred school kids had been arrested in one incident. I don't think there were any pictures of them with Dr. King. But we were white. This was news. In a white supremacy society, a society in which white people are more important than other people, This was a picture to get. This photo is an example of white supremacy being understood well enough that it could be used against white supremacy by people who understood its workings. Now that we've been thinking and talking about white supremacy, I keep seeing it in ways that have previously been invisible to me. Here's a symbol of white supremacy. Hotels and motels welcome their guests with skincare and hair care products. This shampoo works fine on my hair, what I still have of it. If you're black, it's more a case of BYOS, bring your own shampoo. I would not have been aware of this until a friend mentioned it in passing. That easy ignorance. Ooh. White folks shampoo. That easy ignorance. That's white supremacy. It isn't just shouted epithets in Charlottesville. It's the casual ignorance that it's awfully easy to have. So, let's try for a little useful translation of this term, white supremacy. Let's do some shifting of our thinking, our reference points, our assumptions. Let's learn it's not enemy language, but it's actually rather useful. White supremacy pushes all of us, of every ethnicity, to re-examine, shift our thinking. What norms were set by the Mayflower that really didn't work for the Amistad? In what ways are we culturally impoverished by using mostly the reference points of white society? What useful insights are to be gained by widening our vision and expanding our experience? Coming to grips with many ways in which our society has fed white assumptions into our thinking, into our feeling, into our doing, can really be very liberating. It's almost like taking a trip abroad. It's like discovering that maybe Tennessee means Jack Daniels, or approximately Suntory. Let us pause. Let us enter into a time of meditation. We gather in community because we need both challenge and support. We gather in community because we crave both affirmation and question. Here, in this community of faith and of challenge, may we seek for deeper insight. May we ask the hardest questions. May we be ready for unwelcome answers. And may we be open to learning, which comforts and changes us. May our quest for vision and wisdom be walked bravely, and may it take us to new heights and deepen us in our capacity to love